It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France. And this week we're going to focus on the Yellow Vest protest movement. It has been swelling over the past couple of weeks. We've got Florence Villemin now with us on the set to talk more about this. Flo, walk us through how the movement started.
Well, the Yellow Vest or gilets jaunes movement kicked off in mid-November in reaction to a government plan to increase fuel taxes in January. This is part of a transition to clean energy. And so people vented their anger on social media and got organized. And they organized spontaneous protests around the country. They essentially blocked roundabouts. They blocked roads as well. All this while wearing a yellow vest. Now, why the yellow vest? Well, this is actually something that motorists have to keep in their cars for roadside safety. It's been the law since 2008, and so essentially it represents car owners.
But tell us a bit more about just who the protesters are, because it's actually a quite diverse group.
Absolutely. The Yellow Vest movement is unlike any protest movement that we've seen in France in recent years. It's attracted people from across the country, people from across the political spectrum, so from the far right to the far left. They're not affiliated with any trade union. There's no official leader. Now, what they have in common is that most of the protesters live in rural areas where there's not much transportation, public transportation. And so basically, they need their cars to get around. And an increase in the price of fuel makes a big difference for their everyday lives. Take a listen.
I have to drive 60 kilometers a day. I can't do it anymore. I have 3 kids. My wife has one. That makes 4 mouths to feed. We can't do it anymore. We're done.
I pay 200 euros a month in gas. A hike in prices affects my social life. It means I can't go see friends who live far away. I'm stuck. It's more than just about fuel prices. We're fed up. People are suffocating.
As that Yellow Vest protester was just saying, this movement has really become about something much bigger than just a protest over fuel prices.
Well, it's really snowballed into a bigger movement about the standard of living and against inequality here in France. And the list of grievances is really long. People have been calling for an increase in the minimum wage, which is just under 1,500 euros a month, as well as pension reform and tax reform in general. Many of these protesters feel left behind by the government and France's generous public service system. They see that it essentially favors rich urban areas, and this plays into the stereotype that the President Emmanuel Macron is the president of the rich. People have had enough, what they perceive as a double standard, essentially where rich people are getting kickbacks and poor people are footing the bill.
Now, tensions have really come to a boiling point here in Paris. That happened on December 1st when protesters staged very tense protests, not just in Paris, but across the country. But here in the capital, there was all-out rioting, and something that shocked many people, key monuments were vandalized.
Absolutely, and it's quite significant that the rioting here in Paris took place in upscale neighborhoods near the Arc of Triumph, which was vandalized. Now, these neighborhoods are usually immune to violence and such sort of rioting. Essentially, these poor rural protesters brought their protest to the capital so that authorities would pay attention. Take a listen.
We've had enough. All of us have had enough. Look around. These guys have had enough.
I don't have enough to live on. I make 700 euros a month. What am I supposed to do with that?
Stop, please. I work here. Don't worry, the insurance will cover it. But I work here. Well, you have the means to work here. Come work in the south of France. But I work. But you're in Paris.
Some incredible images, but I work too. Yes, but you're in Paris. Flo, tell us a bit about public opinion. Now, despite the violence, like what we just saw there, the movement still does have a lot of support.
And it might be surprising given that vandalism and those images that are really, quite striking. But essentially, over 70% of people support the movement, though it does depend on your income. If you have a higher income, you tend to not support them as much. If you have a lower income, you tend to support them much more. But there is this high support. And why is that? Well, essentially, the Yellow Vest movement echoes grievances that a lot of people can get behind. And also, and this is something that we've already explored here on French Connection, there's a certain respect here in France for people who stand up for their rights and fight the power. A lot of people have been describing this movement as a jacquerie, and that is our word du jour. A jacquerie is actually an expression that dates back to the Middle Ages, and it describes peasant revolts against the noble class. Why jacquerie? Well, at the time, a lot of people were named Jacques.
And of course, there was lots of jacquerie. It really came to a head during the French Revolution.
Which is, of course, part of the founding myth of the French Republic. Social change essentially comes from violent protest. That is the myth. And that's why so many people are also drawing comparison to a more recent violent uprising that happened in May '68.
In 1968, there was destruction, and it ended with the government giving in.
Violence isn't the solution, but at a certain point, if softer tactics aren't getting the message across, then we have to be tough.
That being said, a lot of people also oppose the movement, and particularly those acts of vandalism that have provoked a lot of outrage. In fact, there's a quote that I've been seeing on social media that's from the author Sylvain Tesson. France is a paradise that is full of people who think that they're in hell. Because, sure, taxes are very high here in France, but there also is this very generous public service system with the health system, for instance.
Now, as for the government, after saying it would not bow to pressure from the streets, it actually backpedaled. It suspended that controversial fuel tax hike for 6 months. That, of course, was what sparked these protests. And it also said it's going to launch a consultation, a debate on taxation in France. Is that going to work?
Well, some critics say it's a little bit too little, too late. For instance, there's one of the spokespeople for the Yellow Vest movement who said this is a welcome gesture, but it's just a crumb. And French people won't settle for a crumb. They want a whole baguette. Now, this is a major crisis that the government's facing, and it really could spiral out of control. There's all this pent-up anger that's been building up for years. It's been unleashed by the movement. How do you calm that down? How do you rein that in without busting the national budget? That's really the key question.
Flo, thank you so much for that explanation on just what the Yellow Vest movement is and what it's all about. Thanks so much to you. If you have any other questions for Flo Villeminot for another French Connections, don't forget, you can tweet her at Flo Villeminot, or you can also check out our website, france24.com.